This video is part of the Universes programme run by Leicester Gallery at De Montfort University. The programme responds to the way that popular culture is increasingly situated within wider fictional universes, following the model of much science fiction and speculative fiction. These shared contexts often challenge existing notions of authorship and raise the potential for new political structures and practices. For the programme, we have invited a set of contemporary writers, artists and theorists to respond to the notion of universes and worlds in free-ranging discussions, talks and events. For this video, artist Tom K Kemp hosted a playthrough of his role-playing game in development, After the Maestro, which sees players attempt to form an interim government after a successful labour revolt inside an anthropomorphised city. For the game, Tom invited researcher and writer Dr. Anna McFarlane and artist, broadcaster and architect Andrea Gonzalez to take part. This video brings together parts from that 4-hour play session, interspersed with a post-match analysis between myself, Tom and Anna.
I'm Tom Kemp. I'm an artist, and I've always sort of worked with fiction. I've worked in prose fiction and comics writing and filmmaking and animation, and as part of that practice for the last 4 or 5 years, I've sort of been developing role-playing games, and by that I mean like not video games, but like a tabletop storytelling game. So the most obvious example is Dungeons and Dragons, and I developed these games as a way of kind of co-writing narratives and creating specific kinds of stories for specific phenomena that I'm interested in as an artist.
So I'm a British Academy postdoctoral fellow at the University of Glasgow, and I'm currently working on a project about images of traumatic pregnancy in science fiction. And I suppose my interests have always been in genre fiction, especially science fiction, and particularly cyberpunk. So I'm probably best known for editing the Routledge Companion to Cyberpunk Culture that came out earlier this year.
And the game that Dan mentioned, After the Maestro, is a game I'm working on at the moment, and it, in terms of genre fiction, the genre that this game inhabits is this kind of micro genre of animation called, or on TV tropes anyway, it's called the anthropomorphised anatomy. So these are cartoons that kind of depict, and mostly to educate, they depict the inner body, the human anatomy, as a kind of industrialized, futuristic city in which all of the cells are workers in different kind of interdependent body components. And the game kind of takes that theme and runs with it, and that's kind of what we did yesterday. The reason why the game is called After the Maestro is because the narrative takes place after some kind of successful emancipation or revolt. We can decide exactly how peaceful or non-peaceful that was, has happened within inside a body system, and the Maestro, which in all the cartoons is kind of this central organizing force of the body, the entelechy, the kind of vital force that has like sovereign power and over all the components, is absent, is gone. Whether they've been overthrown, whether they've been peacefully deposed, we don't know yet, but they're not there anymore. Our districts have come together to form the initial transitional government of the new city, and we must determine new goals and independencies and means of survival in the absence of the Maestro's unquestioned authority. This is through deploying our district's skills, negotiating with and gaining the assistance of satellites, which are the other anatomical systems in the body, and trying to keep distrust low, if possible. The game centers around the interpreting of card-based prompts from a series of card decks, and that's combined with map drawing, political negotiation, and collective storytelling in order to create our own anatomical analogies for the city and generate a story of emancipation, struggle, and transformation.
The game leads you to imagine certain scenarios, and it also pushes you away from maybe what your instincts told you to begin with. So for example, like I was one of the sentinels. I was playing the bone marrow, which produces white blood cells and was therefore kind of a combative police force type system. And I started off the game coming from quite a combative position. I was like, okay, we're going to try and take over the body. This is what a game is to me, is like, you know, it's belligerent and I'm going to try and beat other people. And the scenarios that were thrown up were things that really quickly broke down my approach and made it far more complicated. And also that relationship with the other players then, that you've got to kind of react to what they're doing as well. Femur is the biggest bone, so I'm going to be the bone marrow.
Oh, cool. Okay.
Maybe I can just draw like a bit in the middle that will just kind of show that this is kind of inside of the bone. There you go. This is my bone marrow here. So the bone marrow is kind of I suppose it's a bit of like a factory that's making these white blood cells. It's quite aggressive. It's I suppose maybe they're quite unionized together. There's a strong sense of identity in the bone marrow that this is their job is to produce these white blood cells, and their specialty is border control. So there's a strong ideology that they're protecting themselves and maybe, like, you know, by extension the rest of the body, but, you know, definitely they're kind of in it for themselves and for the strength of their particular sector. So they're very against things coming in from the outside, and they're going to produce more and more white blood cells to try and stop that from happening. And they have a long history of working with the apparati, especially I put antibacterials and antibiotics, but like whatever, like they're going to work with anything that comes into the body that's that they can use to help their cause, because they don't see the apparati as being particularly affiliated with other parts of the body, so it doesn't get in the way of their kind of search for dominance and control. And during the emancipation, they plotted an efficient military coup. What has stopped them taking power now? Maybe they're kind of like slightly worn out after those efforts, but they're still definitely like plotting in the background that they feel like they can have some dominance over the rest of the body. But obviously that's possibly going to cause problems, because it's no good having your immune system running riot, obviously. So so they see themselves definitely as a force for good, and everything that they're doing is justified, but they're maybe not realizing the kind of detrimental effects that that's going to have in the long run for all the rest of the body, and potentially even for themselves as well.
Andrea Gonzalez played with us, who is a veteran of the game, so she joined us yesterday. She was playing as people who lived in the pituitary gland, who were these kind of almost like ghosts who would kind of heighten other parts of the body's intuition.
Okay, so I am the relay. Specifically, I chose the pituitary gland, which is specialized in chemical broadcasting, which is a form of broadcasting that is not verbal. And we can know a bit more about it on how the citizens of this district are. They are invisible. You cannot see them. You can only notice their effects or their presence and the traces, the traces. Like you can, like, so there's kind of some time situation. So like things are not, because I realized that it, like the pineal gland is about, pituitary gland, sorry. The pineal gland is Daniel's one, is in charge of very like major hormone hormone delivery of the body. So I think it's beautiful. Like actually you only notice with delay what hormones do. So like there's like this fact of delay that you feel what is happening, but it's not directly in the moment when it's actually happening. So there's like this transition. And in the emancipation, they were pretty like important because they delivered an incendiary news report, which was based in collective intuition and intelligence. So it was basically enhancing the ability of other parts of the body to feel each other and to kind of unite through a kind of somatic level. They have the main station of the pituitary gland, which looks like more or less like this. This is the main one, but then there's some others, small ones.
So they are.
So yeah,
So they're
it's
kind
more
of
of
like ghosts or something. They're like these invisible messengers.
yeah, they're like ghosts.
And what does it feel like to if we imagine that one of us is a citizen and you get a message from through the pituitary gland? How does it come to you? How does it feel? It's in your. Is it? I guess if it's non-verbal, it's like a sensation.
Yeah. So it would like I think it's like it has a lot of dialogue with this thing of agency that you were posing in the beginning. So what agency means, and like it's when you are kind of trying to know, for example, whether you are asking like introspectively, you are asking some question, then through this broadcast you will kind of feel body sensations that drawn to you, like, so if you're asking yourself like, is this a moment for action, and there's like this ghost streaming happening, you will notice that your body is getting ready for action somehow, like as a,
I put down that maybe that I would be the pineal gland, which is sort of a sense organ, but it's kind of vestigial. Well, the first card that I had was said that there was an easily identifiable sound. The first thing that came into my head was the sound of laughter, but I don't know. Yeah, maybe I'll just stick with that. It doesn't really make sense to the function of the place, but
we'll figure it out.
Maybe maybe it says that it's dark, and why is it dark, and how do the buildings there reflect this? So I've put that it's enclosed, it's been walled in and slightly forgotten about, but that there's some connection, like vague connections with the rest of the body or the brain that are left, and that the building has no windows because it's always dark.
They've been like walled up in the tower.
Yeah, that kind of thing, like an old part of a city that's been kind of surrounded by other buildings, but it's still there or something. We used the sort of available technologies of the organs as a kind of wetware. So, for example, sort of using the central nervous system as a communication system, or I think at one point did Andrea like forged what did she make that tunnel out of that went?
They built a kind of or they packed loads of themselves into one structure to make a tunnel to the hippocampus, right? Was it the hippocampus? I think. So that was a kind of body, a self-body modification. So you're building like a communications tunnel to the city records to kind of like hardwire that up a bit.
To see if we can just break these kind of barriers that it's for everything. It's for all the network, actually.
How do you build? How do your invisible workers build stuff? Or like, what can they physically move things around?
No, they need others.
Okay. I guess the idea behind makeshift stuff is they're like kind of moving existing materials, or it's like a temporary structure somehow, and then it can become more permanent later, maybe. So it could be that it's more just with their own bodies, or through mass. I don't know. It's almost like a swarm, right? Your district.
Out of, for example, if you make a hole in a building, this hole is like can create for example, a wind tunnel or something like that. So, but this is actually a situation that can happen by action of many different individuals. Like eventually there's a hole, or eventually there's a path. So it's more on these kind of soft changes on the city that are not so like building a monument somehow, no? But more like a accumulation of actions.
One sort of subgenre of cyberpunk, like David Cronenberg's Existence, where sort of biological matter is used as the stuff out of which technologies are formed.
My colleague Lars Schmeink has written about this. His book is called Biopunk Dystopias. So he argues that biopunk is the next level after cyberpunk that'll be much more integrated with that biological aspect.
So I am the pancreas, and I think the pancreas is going to be down here somewhere. The pancreas is a big energy refinery, and the vibe of the pancreas is very like it's like very smug, clean energy kind of atmosphere. So my question was the architecture here was designed to make citizens feel a certain way. And so the architecture in the pancreas was designed to be this like super futuristic and kind of self-important architecture that's maybe like a little bit bogus. It's a bit like a kind of like a vape shop or something, you know, a bit too clean. And but it makes them feel like they're these incredibly efficient and self-important futuristic members of the body system. However, during the emancipation, there were a series of because they were kind of so overworked during that period, there was a series of explosions in the refinery. So the pancreas is actually quite diminished at the moment. It's had some fairly bad losses recently. So I don't know. I'm just going to draw some. Is that an explosion? Kind of.
Well, that was another thing that we spoke about a lot was mythology. We ended up talking about this because when the hippocampus came into the game, the hippocampus was like the memory store, so it was the city archives. But we had this impression of them as being like really stuck in the past. But then also when the knowledge from the hippocampus came into other areas of the body, we talked about how it was going to remember what had happened, and it was going to make the myth of how we had come to create this new type of city.
So it says the city has a stereotype about inhabitants that come from here. What is it?
What do you think it is?
Nostalgia.
Nice. Yeah. How is that? How is that expressed in the people that live in the hippocampus?
They're unable to live in the present. They only live oriented towards the past.
Maybe they're just like always going on and on and on about like some old story, and you're kind of like, come on, I want you to get to the point so we can get on with things. And yeah, but they're just always going, oh, and another time this happened. So I suppose kind of like our stereotype of maybe like old people, who they just like talk a lot about things that have happened in the past, and we kind of just want them to move on so we can get things done.
Yeah, I like them being like boomer glorifying history buffs.
This satellite, the hippocampus, has not been informed of the emancipation and still believes the Maestro is in power. Should you tell them the truth? Basically, from what I understood, it's not that they have not been informed, it's that they are unable, like also regarding how information works, they are unable to feel any different state of being that is not based on their idea on what the city is. So it's really difficult to establish communication. So it's really, really difficult that we tell them what is going on. But they must be, I think, from what I'm reading in the internet, is like they can be a very, very good ally for us, because they can enhance our, like, they're like experts in navigation and expansion, so they can provide us a very useful insight on a broader vision. But it's very difficult to move this city, like this district, out of their comfort zone. We don't have form of communication with them because they are just like in their nostalgic vibes.
Yeah.
Like they are also very slow.
Well, so basically, if we want them to help us, we have to decide how we're going to communicate this to them, and that might need a set of skills that we don't have yet. It might be that I could justify using chemical broadcasting. I don't know. We'd have to talk about it.
One of the things that reminded me of was Donna Haraway. Obviously, she's got her famous essay, The Cyborg Manifesto. But in that same book, she also has an essay where she talks about Ronald Reagan's Star Wars project that he had at the time. And Donna Haraway in her book argues that this is kind of that hyper-militarization of America. It's almost like relevant to AIDS and the way that AIDS works within the body. So that hyperimmune system that actually turns out to destroy the very system that it's trying to protect. If the workers are completely, they are working really well, they're doing their job within the context of the body, that can be a negative thing. So, you know, if you've got a hyperimmune system, that's terrible. If you're growing, then obviously you're supposed to grow, you're supposed to replace cells. But if that happens at a hyper level, then that becomes cancerous. And I think the only thing that came close with us in the game was that there was a non-citizen, which was a bacteria that infected the kidneys. So that bacteria was, I think Andrea said it was a cystitis.
Yeah.
So that like had been in balance with the body previously and had just gone out of balance. There was a wee bit too much. But rather than eradicate it, we pushed it back to a point where it was once again within balance in the body. So again, it's much more relevant to that way of like, let's not treat things as purely intruders. Let's not, you can't have a pure philosophy when it comes to this kind of thing. It's all systems thinking and it's all about equilibrium and relationships.
Okay, so kidney, for example, when you have a kidney infection, right? Is it the same as is this the same as cystitis? So yeah, that for example, okay, this is a free interpretation of what it is. But there's a shortage on like how like the fluid comes because there's some blockages. Because this also like this bacteria need like the tubes to grow. So like there's like other citizens growing in the places where these citizens need the inflow coming. So yeah, if there's a lot of like outside, yeah, if there's a lot of bacteria and there's a lot of non-citizens in this area, basically the kidney is dry, so that there's no functioning.
Well, a nice thing about the fact that we decided to rebalance ourselves with the non-citizens of the cystitis is that eventually we sort of figured out that probably our city, our body system wouldn't survive indefinitely, but the infection will be able to pass from to other bodies and kind of carry on the story of our city. I quite like the idea of we have this bacteria, this cystitis bacteria, that could kind of spread. It could like leave our city and enter another city, and bring with it stories of this place where things just kind of started working completely differently. The key texts or whatever that I was thinking about were particularly this educational cartoon Il était une fois la vie, or Once Upon a Time Life, which is 1987, I think. And what's striking about it for the period is it depicts this body system, and it's very optimistic and upbeat, but it's a totally dystopian techno-feudal society where the Maestro is appearing everywhere by video screen.
You were specifically guiding us towards a more science fictional interpretation of what was happening rather than something fantastic. I believe you said that at the outset of the game anyway, something about how, crazy things could happen, but there's these things that are kind of built into it to make it go in a more logical manner.
Generally speaking, all of these cartoons, the sort of society that they are is it's like industrialized and it's quite technocratic in a way. Most people's like abilities or the way that people can act and have agency is through different types of usually through different types of technology and things, rather than, let's say, having magical powers. If you look into the history of Dungeons and Dragons, which we can broadly assume is the kind of origin point of a lot of this, the whole fantasy aspect of it was it was almost a side note. So originally it was supposed to be this military simulator game, and then the people, Gary Gygax and Marnison, who made it, put the kind of addendum in the book that was oh, by the way, if you want to put your Lord of the Rings characters in here, or put a Grey Mouser, or any of these pulp sword and sorcery people in the game, here's probably how they would work. And then that tiny addendum became way more popular than the original source material, and kind of almost formalized this whole genre, which is the kind of D&D fantasy game. And that, with contemporary role-playing games, they're very self-aware about almost deconstructing what in D&D terms, what a fantasy bard would be, or a fantasy wizard, or you buy a cyberpunk game and it's kind of an amalgam of Neuromancer and Snow Crash and then anime, and you can kind of pick and choose your characters from all of these different archetypes and then see how they interact.
So I think maybe it just makes sense that it's the central nervous system is broadcasting, is sort of spreading this rumor, because it's able to reach everyone pretty much.
How is it?
By
what medium does the central nervous system broadcast?
Maybe in a more underhand way. So maybe it's just spreading this information by word of mouth, where ordinarily it would broadcast information through loudspeakers that are distributed throughout the city in a standard kind of dystopian manner. But it's unplugged the PA system, and now it's just whispering in people's ears.
And I was really interested to read about your writing about Naomi Mitchison. You yourself kind of draw a line between her role as a nurse and then the science fiction that she wrote later. If that is a canon of itself, maybe, with starting with Mitchison and then with this later work.
Yeah, well, my argument with Mitchison is that her work as a nurse inspired her science fiction, because a lot of her science fiction is about caring and making connections with alien beings. For example, in her memoirs of the Space Woman, the Space Woman in question is a linguist who communicates with other species, and I think that there's a link there between Naomi Mitchison's work that she did as a nurse. So she was caring for enemy troops sometimes, and in the anthology that you mentioned that I co-edited with Gavin Miller, it was called The Practical Guide to the Resurrected, and we found that the way science fiction discourse is used in a lot of more in a lot of real non-fictional contexts, the way that it's used is very much techno-optimism. In our project, we used the example of this thing called the SpaceX Prize, that was trying to find a real inventor that can make a tricorder. So instead of going to the doctor, you could have this thing that would diagnose an illness, and thereby saving you a trip, and just automating the doctor-patient process. That was how it was being used by, I suppose, venture capitalists and people that had invested in these innovations. But in science fiction itself, we find a much more skeptical attitude towards that. So I suppose these different things are balanced within medicine.
I guess at the time, there was a lot of discourse around the the incorporation of like wellness as a kind of way of optimizing yourself as being more suited to certain workplaces and things. And I guess I was thinking about the idea of like kind of totally incorporated or very literally embodied like capitalist realism, where like all of these systems are like it's your responsibility to make sure your own body is functioning in the most optimum and productive way it can. And then that is very clearly represented within these cartoons where you have all of these laborers, and none of them really like their jobs particularly, but they literally can't do anything else apart from perform their roles. And that when we get to the kind of cells at work anime and manga which started about 5 years ago, that becomes extremely clear. The cell workers who are experiencing this body horror in a different way, it's probably super emancipatory, it's probably super exciting for them. And that was kind of one of my starting ideas that totally leads into a kind of a post-human or perhaps a xenofeminist kind of position on these things. The pineal gland tipped off the pituitary gland, usefully or not, which kind of like innovated and energized the bone marrow, who with kind of mutual support from the pancreas were able to kind of like go on strike and shut things down and depose the Maestro, I guess through force, I assume. And now, because we were the 4 districts of the city to kind of begin to put this together, we are now the 4 districts who've kind of come together sometime after to try and figure out what we should do now and how we're going to keep the city running and what needs to happen.
The only true analogy for the body is the body, but you know, why choose a city and not a machine? And then how important that city setting is to cyberpunk.
Cyberpunk's really interested in systems, and that could be the system of the body. So if you think about the cyborg, where it's like a person who's been augmented with technology, and that could be technology that's implanted into you in some way, or just technology that you interact with on a really meaningful basis that ends up making up part of what this body is. So there's the element of the cyborg as a system, and the city almost acts as like there's these microcosms that move to the macrocosmic. So you've got the body as a system of the cyborg, you've got the city as this organism that works with all these different factional elements in it that create this certain thing that can't be replicated. And then you can zoom out and zoom out. And I suppose that part of the reason for cyberpunk to do this was probably a reaction to globalization and that knowledge that something that's happening in Japan in a boardroom is going to affect your life here in rural Ohio, that kind of thing. It's kind of seeing the world as a system, so everything else becomes that way. It's like defined by relations and interdependent with each other, rather than defined as being something that has a human consciousness, or individualism doesn't mean the same thing in cyberpunk that it means elsewhere. So I suppose that's the way that the game would relate. That comparison of the body and the city, I think that is a very cyberpunk thing, and it's a very politically freighted thing as well. It's something that definitely comes from a critique of globalization and neoliberalism. But
yeah, there are a lot of positions that are taken in the game, particularly in the way I write about the different classes of people, of like workers in the city. So when I talk about the sentinels, who are more or less the immune system of the body, I'm kind of lacing that with a kind of narrative that's obviously talking about sovereign power over violence, and the wheel, which is the kind of like the kind of parts of the body that are to do with like restoration and reproduction and like energy production. I guess I was trying to build in some kind of discourse around like care and invisible labor into that section of the body. Yeah, the relay, which is like the class, which is all the kind of information sending the body, the central nervous system, the pituitary gland, as Andrea Gonzalez. A big question there is like, is this like an impartial system under the Maestro, or is this like, does it have its own have its own biases. So I feel like it was inflected but in all these other things I was thinking about at the time. You know, like how parts of our DNA are made up from like virus DNA that has kind of mutated and allowed cells to reproduce and consume. And then if you took that knowledge and then you took the premise of Il était une fois la vie, where the viruses and the germs are these kind of like invading, menacing forces that are coming, always kind of trying to cross into the body's territory, then the actual biological reality that we are 60% non-human DNA and that our entire makeup is made from this kind of viral history would be completely horrifying, right?
Let's classify journalism as rumour spreading and say that they are enacting a kind of journalism.
A really kind of athletic. It's like a journalist in a movie that is like played by like an A-list celebrity and is really works out and has time to actually like exercise and stuff. Like when Arnold Schwarzenegger plays like a scientist or a policeman, and you're like, how do you have time to know this and have
But yeah, keen to hear thoughts on this kind of role-playing game as a way of writing.
Because you're using kind of like prompts, ludic prompts from the game that might ask you questions or provoke unexpected situations that people kind of have to improvise with in the moment. I always think of it as a kind of like synthesizing tool. So it's kind of people bring their own experience and knowledge and specialities into this one story, and then the kind of willingness to make that story contingent and make it make sense as a group. We don't want to like tell a kind of random series of anecdotes. We kind of all want it to work as a narrative. It gives this collective narrative its own kind of autonomy or agency. So it starts to go in places you don't expect. You might come up with you make an idle joke or a reference to something, and then that becomes a character in the story you're telling. And then suddenly, half an hour later, that character becomes super important, and you have to contend with the information you've put in. And that's happened through drawing a card or rolling dice badly or well.
I mean, one of the things that emerged in my research, and maybe will come up through the project, to do with this kind of universal scale of fictioning is the sort of affect of complexity that runs throughout it, like the idea that many things are unfolding at one point in time. Timescales and temporal bandwidth are not limited in the way that they have been in traditional fiction making, and also that's a result of the fact that you often have multiple authors working within a singular fictional universe and creating storylines that don't necessarily agree with each other all the time.
In a very local way, you're kind of writing this story with people around you to perpetuate itself for those people. But there is also a huge industry of like actual play, role playing, where you like record sessions or you record audio of sessions and edit them into like an audio drama. And there's something interesting about them because they almost feel like single author narratives to an extent, or they have a veneer of like a single author narrative, but then the more you listen to them, they're just not stories that fit to like a structure that you'd be comfortable with, and the way in which they zoom in and out of detail, and the way in which things get derivated all over the place, or an idea about where the story is going changes instantly, can suddenly break the illusion that you're listening to something that has been kind of predetermined. And I think that's maybe something that I think about in my work, particularly when I make like film versions of the games that I play, is that I try and emulate these sudden shifts of context or these sudden kind of spontaneous changes in where the story is going and what it's able to do.
Okay, so it says that a satellite provisionally nominates you for new city ruler. Is this well received? I think it's well received amongst the people of the pineal gland, but everyone else is surprised that the pineal gland exists.
Which satellite nominates you? So I guess you've got the choice of the heliocampus, the the kidneys, and the central nervous system.
I think it makes sense that it would be the hippocampus, drawing upon their ancestral memory.
Do you embrace this, or do you try and brush it off?
I think we're very happy about it, but the reality of our ability to act as leader is spurious. But we're optimistic about our chances.
I have to say, I really find that from playing the game yesterday, because, well, like Dan said, my background is partly in the medical humanities, as well as what we discussed before. So that basically means it's humanities approaches to medical subjects. So the history of medicine and literature in medicine specifically, that's my kind of forte. And I worked on a project called Science Fiction in the Medical Humanities. It was a Wellcome Trust funded project at Glasgow under Dr. Gavin Miller. And we, like Dan said, we worked on more single author texts for that. And one of the things that the premise of After the Maestro reminded me of the most was probably Isaac Asimov's Fantastic Voyage. But I thought what was interesting is that in single author science fiction, we tend to have these pulp science fiction adventure fantasies, so like Fantastic Voyage, and it's very much it is following that adventure story, and it's that Cold War background kind of gives it that. There's definitely factions, and there's clear goals that are trying to be achieved in a warlike kind of system, I suppose. And on the other hand, you do get more experimental science fiction or more social science fiction that might try and push against that narrative. It might be more critical of those systems, but it is still consciously forwarding a more singular agenda. But the game leads you to imagine certain scenarios, and it also pushes you away from maybe what your instincts told you to begin with. So I think all of that was very interesting on a political level, that it's not coming from an individualistic perspective. It does force you to try and think of things in a more naturalistic way, and almost as a better way of thinking about history and how things are formed and how political factions are formed. There's a bit of incidental circumstance that comes into it, and it's very contingent on the circumstances. It's not something that one person can force.
So the next card that I'm going to play, it says, using deception or misdirection, citizens of your district are able to enact a plan without being held directly responsible. Describe the moment they do this. And it also says, make a move, players cannot create any distrust in response. So tell me if I can do this, but what I'm thinking is, the citizens of mine that were previously in the hippocampus that had created that kind of that moment of community that we had earlier, they're no longer under the influence of the pituitary gland, like we just heard. So they are in the hippocampus, find themselves again under their own direction, and they can do what they want. So they think that what they're going to do is they're going to go and provide that security force to the central nervous system as their private security. So it's citizens of my district, but because they're coming from the hippocampus, the bone marrow isn't held directly responsible for this. It's a kind of offshoot of the faction. And the reason that they do this is because they see that the central nervous system is gaining in power, because the pituitary gland has taken a back seat now and gone off on its own in this isolationist kind of move. So they think that if they go and provide this private service, they're kind of getting in on ground level with a system that can possibly give them more power, more authority, and help them to gain their desires of having authority over the whole city.
Our assumption kind of is that the Maestro has been performing this control role in maintaining sort of homeostasis within the body, and that now that he's been removed in some way, the organs of the body are free to could perform sort of runaway growth or its opposite. But actually, I suppose we were also having to perform other kinds of control, to step in to sort of fill the void that the Maestro had vacated.
Kind of going back more historically to these kind of body politic images is of course the really famous frontispiece of Thomas Hobbes, Leviathan, where it's it's an amazing image, this big giant made of all the kind of populace of the nation, and then the head is the king's head, and the implication is that if you become headless, then it's the war of all against all and all that kind of thing. And so there's a kind of, you can draw this quite clear lineage or canon, if you like, from that to these cartoons where there's always the mayor or the maestro who is kind of determining everything.
I think I could maybe imagine a coronation of the pineal gland as a kind of figurehead for the city, that, like you're saying, it's not necessarily that we know how it's going to bring us together, but almost just the fact that everyone's like not against the pineal gland, and maybe the fact that they've been cut off, maybe it means that they're seen as a bit more of a neutral force. So they can have this coronation, but it is like the British monarchy, where they're not necessarily like actually in power. It's just like they're a figurehead.
There's one conception of world building which is like you've got everything fleshed out, and you've got the entire history of a place and the economy and everything that's ever happened there. And then I guess there's another way of doing it, which is maybe closer to, I guess, what more contemporary role-playing games do, where you're kind of creating the world around you as you move through it. I mean, the kind of world building of the source material, the cartoons, is not really that cohesive. They definitely like fudge elements because fundamentally the analogy is, I mean, there is no analogy for the body but itself. You might say, if you were a true phenomenologist, they all kind of always end up in a fairly phenomenological position, where we did have it in the game we played. The pituitary gland completely kind of absconded from the body system and became these independent ghost signals. So maybe you can tell me, so the pituitary gland, you can tell me if this would work. Could we use, even though you're ghosts, kind of like you're disconnected in terms of messaging from the city, could we like use the kidneys to kind of transport you outside of the city?
I think so. I think it's more a matter of finding mediums. It's not that we just like are without, like we left our previous infrastructure, so we can find more a different kind of transmission medium, and it makes sense that the kidney is that medium, no? Because the kidneys regulate like this fluid exchanges also.
Or we can transfer you. My thought was whether you would be up for leaving the city and trying to find some help outside.
I think that makes sense to the kidney, no? Like it's like flow.
Yeah.
So we can just like be transported in that flow.
Yeah, exactly.
No?
Yeah.
I think that makes sense.
So I'm gonna I guess that means we're gonna flush some of the pineal gland out and see if they can find anything that's gonna help in this slightly worrying situation. I guess a big idea of weird fiction, which may be coming back to systems thinking and stuff, is that weird fiction is the protagonists are inside systems that they just can't comprehend, right? They're kind of thrown against complexity, but they only get these kind of slices of what that complexity is. And I think that that is both quite relevant to the way that I think about role-playing games, and also a way of coming to terms with like interdependency and complexity, which is kind of also what the game does, is that as we did in our game, you do end up with these kind of strange new systems that you kind of have a sense of working, but you kind of had to compromise all of this stuff and undergo all these transformations to reach. And maybe even the new weird, right? Because the new weird is more like accepting of the fact that you are going to be horrified and then transformed by experiencing complexity. Or an analogy that I use when I talk about this process is thinking of these games as like almost like a very complicated Ouija board. So on a Ouija board, which is actually sold as a board game, everyone puts their hand on the planchette, the kind of pointer, and it appears to move around on its own and speak to you. and of course it's sort of ambiguous whether this is a kind of group human activity or whether this is actually a kind of voice from beyond. And actually I would kind of say that it's sort of both at the same time. And with role-playing games, I think it's also it's kind of this way of, I always think of it as this way of channeling a kind of collective agency or collective assumption into its own form, a story that starts telling itself. Here we go. When the game ends, we each get to describe a final scene. It can relate to your own district or the city as a whole. Bear in mind the total final level of distrust, which we did quite well with. And this can be a zoomed out scene. This can be happening a long time in the future. It can be, you can choose, it might not be immediately. You could think it's like the epilogue, if you like. And there's some questions to think about. Is the city sustainable? What happens when our city encounters another city? Similarly, does our city have a reputation outside of itself? Does the city ever reproduce? And most cities eventually crumble. What happens to ours? We've got a hippocampus who's still kind of cut off, but is slightly intermingled with the central nervous system, which again is kind of intermingled with the bone marrow. We've got the pineal gland that believes it's in charge, but is kind of ineffective. We've got the ultra nomadic and almost ghost-like pituitary gland, which has kind of left and re-entered the body. And we've got the kind of consolidated clean energy power of the pancreas and the kidneys working away at the center of the city.
But then there's this question about most cities eventually crumble. What happens to ours? It's not built on a particularly solid foundation, and we didn't ever get to the bottom of a lot of the questions that we had. Like, what did the pineal gland ever do to, rule the body before the Maestro? And did the central nervous system ever have the backing of the Maestro behind it? We never answered these questions.
It's true.
It's almost like, we just had to go for like a real politic and just say, well, regardless of what this is, let's just act on the basis of what we know. And so is that a strong foundation? I don't know. Maybe it's not stronger or weaker than any other city.
It's true that those rumors never really got addressed. And I quite like that in a way. Maybe you're right. That is more like it's more like these urban legends, right? That float around. I guess my ideas around, if the city was just gonna, it could last forever, but then it would need a way of like perpetuating its citizens, which it doesn't seem like we had. So maybe it does kind of wind down eventually, but the stories about it do pass from city to city through the cystitis, perhaps.
It's like a myth because all our conscious is away through the lungs, no? And then we have also our feelings are like spread into the water and like other liquids and like encountering other forms or agglomerations. And then actually it became like this kind of Eden of bacteria where there's no more human, but there's like a very very also dangerous force waiting to be like awakened. So like it's more like it's like a mythological city somehow. It became kind of this, no? Like this kind of Eden, lost mythological Eden of non-human existence.
Well, also it because we kind of started reincorporating and distributing the memory, the hippocampus throughout the city. I guess it would kind of mythologize itself, right? It's kind of constantly remembering its own. I guess that makes sense that it would kind of pass into story because it starts being made up of more and more memory, perhaps.
It would be a bit like a cargo cult if anyone else wanted to replicate it. It would be like a cargo cult because, like, we didn't try to kind of make it the way it was based on, any kind of schema. we just kind of fell into it almost. So it would be bizarre to try and then like create that, replicating the same mistakes that we made and everything. It would be bizarre to do that. Thank you so much for inviting me. That was really good fun. It's so interesting, and I think I actually learned about biology a bit as well.
Good. I guess that's the original cartoons are supposed to teach you something, I guess. And maybe we've come up with a more educational model of how those things work.
Thank you for reminding me. It's my favorite game in the world.